Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Wheel of Games. Today we're going to introduce our fifth game from the wheel, Carnival Zombie. It's Carnival, not Carnival, because it takes place in Venice. Carnival Zombie is a game where you cooperatively play as a group of survivors in a zombie-infested Venice, where you're, for the most part, fighting to escape the city. The story is that Venice is built upon a sleeping Leviathan, and the Leviathan's starting to wake up, which is causing the dead to rise. It's not clear if it's an infection or some kind of necromancy thing, but during the day, the Leviathan summons the dead down towards the base of the city, where all those the pillars are keeping the city afloat, and it's using those undead to help break down those pillars and free the Leviathan. But at night, the zombies are free to come up into the streets and attack your survivor characters. The Leviathan isn't explicitly a Lovecraftian thing, but it definitely has some parallels in the theming. Speaking in broad terms, the game takes place in alternating day and night sequences over the course of 3 days. During the day, your characters have some freedom to move around the city. They can search, try to heal their wounds, that sort of a thing. But at night, you fight in a sort of Castle Panic style survival game, and if you've played Castle Panic, this sort of concentric rings with their different quadrants is going to look very familiar. But it's a survival game where your survivors hold out in the center against hordes of zombies that are approaching from the outside. At the end of the night, you have to fight your way out so that you can move between the different locations of the city during the next day. I mentioned it takes place over 3 days. That's the standard story mode. There's also a broad number of different scenarios that you can play that have special different conditions, including notably the tutorial one is called Plague in Venice. That's a slightly shorter game, but there's a whole bunch of different ones. And there's also a different sort of gameplay map, I guess, called Mediolanum. And if I flip over the map for a second, you can see that there's a different place with a whole different set of locations, a little bit of different art. It even has its own little book there. So there's a good chunk of content to this game. In addition, there's also a special mode just for advanced players called the Path of Saints. And honestly, this thing is still even beyond me. I'm not going to try to explain the advanced mode in at least this video. That's a good ways off. I think this game is fairly difficult, although it's much less complicated than it looks at first glance. It looks like there's a lot going on, but actually, if you really boil it down to one type of thing at a time, like I'm hoping to do today, you'll find that it's really not as difficult as it looks at first glance. In the standard game mode, you have 3 days to escape the city, and your starting point within the city, there's the broad city map up here. Your starting point is dictated by the difficulty level, so on an easier game, you start closer to where all of the exits from the city are, and in a difficult game, you start as far as possible from everything else. And your goal is to reach one of 3 different finales for escaping. There is a bridge that you can escape from the far end of the city. There's a couple of ports where there are boats that you can try to escape on, and if you first go to this radio station and call for evac, you can go to this airship up here, and there's a special finale for that. If you want to play it says it's a bit harder of a mode, but if you can find the special weapon, then you can attempt to use it in the heart of the city to try to actually destroy the Leviathan, as opposed to escaping the city. And each one of those has its own special finale sheet that has sort of like its own little mini scenario. I honestly haven't played any of them yet, but it sounds like it's a special holdout fight kind of scenario. They each have very special rules, like in the airship, you're specifically holding out in a cemetery that gets placed on top of this middle tile, and it can like rotate during the night to move your survivors around. The boat one, I know there's like a special boat tile that you put down, and you have to fight the infected off the ship. So I do believe that the different finale scenarios you can play out very differently. Now, if at the end of that 3rd day you haven't reached one of the scenarios, you instead play A Night Without Dawn, which has a different backing. Don't know if that means it's extra hard or something, but basically after the third day, your game ends one way or another, and you get this finale instead. Instead of one of the escape or kill the Leviathan finales. I think the next thing that we should go over are the characters and their stats. So this is an example of a character sheet. There's a nice art print on one side. This character is named Captain Spaventa. He's sort of like a commander type character. And we'll explain what all the different symbols on his card means. Of note, each character also has their own completely separate item decks. So unlike, say, Zombicide, where you're searching and you're just pulling from a collective deck, each character has their own completely separate pools of items that they can find while they're searching. I guess this helps make sure that characters have things that suit their playstyle. I think each deck has 10, maybe a dozen cards in them. A game will always consist of 6 characters, and depending on the number of players that you have, the game gives suggestions on how to divide those characters among the different players. One of the first things that you do is you choose the orders that your characters are going to be activating and put their markers on the board. So for our example, if we were playing with Captain Spaventa and he was the first character, you would put him on the first position. And each of the other characters has their own unique marker, and this will determine the activation order pretty much throughout the game. Anytime there's a phase where players are taking actions in turn, you just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The first character has some extra particular responsibilities. The first player is responsible for like setting up the tactical map, basically a lot of the bookkeeping kind of things. The first character also, in the rules, is responsible for resolving disputes between the different players. The first player, or the first character's player, may tend to be the more experienced player in the group, and the game actually does suggest some rules about like limiting the types of things you can say during combat time. A little bit like Gloomhaven, I suppose, to things like help over there or shoot kind of things, so that to try to help limit when you've got that commander type player at the game table and you don't want to just have all the other people become spectators. I believe there are 6 characters that come with the base game, and I'm not sure if it's from the Mediolanum expansion or perhaps like a Kickstarter exclusive thing, but I do have a total of 9. Now, the other aspect that this tracker down at the bottom of the board has is it's also tracking your character's health. These are considered to be stress. It's sort of a stand-in for both mental and physical stress that your characters are coming under. So if a infected attacks your character, that invokes stress. If an event, does something to you, it's also just considered stress. When your characters are right on that center point, they're perfectly healthy. Each point of stress takes them a step away from that perfect health. When you reach the red area, you are considered to be in terror, which reduces some of your abilities. It prevents you from doing certain things, mostly during combat. And if you go off the track, not just being at the last tape, but actually going all the way off the track, then your character is incapacitated. You remove them and their marker from the board until another character gets a chance to revive them during a future daytime step. Okay, let's go back in, focus on the card again. Each character has special abilities, some that are only active during the night and some that are only active during the day. There's a handy sheet that explains what all of these things do. We can go over the character-specific abilities, I think, more towards the end, once we understand what these things actually do, after we've gone over all the combat actions during the night. So I'm going to save that bit until later, but yeah, there's a very nice handy reference sheet that has your character abilities. It also has all the special location information and also flavor information for all of the special infected. So his nighttime ability, Commander, and during the daytime he gets a veteran ability. We'll go over them towards the end. Now this little cross swords red number 2 here, that is his default melee ability. You may find items that give you, additional options for melee attacks, but he basically has a sword that can do 2 damage. Each character has something like that. As an example, this sniper lady, she has a melee attack value of 1. Now, on the bottom row, you have the character's default ranged attack weapon. It's actually fairly similar to Zombicide in terms of what the stats actually mean. The first number one here with the bullets, that is the number of hits. So exactly like Zombicide, you're assigning hits to the infected that are in your space. Yeah, the term infected and zombie is pretty much interchangeable. For the most part, the rules call them infected, even though the game name is Carnival Zombie. Either word perfectly works. The second number is wounds, very similar to the lethality in Zombicide. It's how much damage you do with each one of those hits. Now, because his weapon is a shotgun, it also has that last symbol, that little explosion symbol. And what that means is it's explosive ammo. So when he shoots, he hits every zombie that's within that space. So he only does one hit, but that hit hits every zombie in the space with a wound of 1 damage. And the last thing is the range. So that's the distance out from the refuge where all your survivors are, what ring that he can hit. So he can only hit zombies that are in the first ring of whatever quadrant he's in. But at least he'll hit all the zombies in that ring. That will show another person just as a example, or a counterexample. Her special ability at night is Sniper, and daytime she has Exploration ability. She has what looks like a rifle, and it has a scope of 3, so that means she can shoot basically anywhere within her quadrant, and a lethality of 2, again, only 1 hit. Let's see, here's one more example that I really want to give to counterbalance, is a heavy weapons specialist. So big gun, 3 hits that all do 1 wound apiece at range 3. There's a wide variety, shotgun hit everyone, sniper, heavy assault weapons, and then if you have different weapons, you can use those stats instead of your default weapon stats here. And now I think we should look at some item cards that you would find, because I want to go over what some of these different stats would mean. So this is looking at Captain Spaventa's deck, and here's an example of a melee weapon that he could find. So the moon indicates that it's only usable at night. This is a combat weapon. And where it says 1-1, instead of having his normal 2 damage attack, this means that he can do 2 separate 1 damage attacks. So he could kill 2 zombies with health 1, instead of, say, overkilling 1 zombie by doing 2 wounds to it. Or he could apply both of those to the same zombie that has health 2, and so he could still do 2 damage to 1 zombie. But the 1-1 means is 2 separate attacks of 1 apiece. Here's another example that shows some useful information. So what that star means is if you're playing on the easy difficulty, you start with certain items from your item deck. If we were playing on easy mode, Spaventa would start with this item basically already drawn in hand, so to speak. The little red symbol here means that you discard it after use, so it's a one-time use item. The moon there again means that this item only has meaning during the night, and that golden moon indicates that it can only be used during the first hour of the night. And there's a little reminder thing. It's a little bit hard to see, I think, but on the first hour of night, there's this little golden moon that exactly matches the golden moon that's on that card. Typically, these things that you have to use on the first hour of the night is a buff that lasts through the entire night, so you play it at the start of the night, and you get that effect each hour. You don't lose it after the first hour. So in this example, you get +1 hit for each of his fire actions during the night. He gets to make a second hit, or he could hit the same one twice and deal 2 damage to all of the zombies in there. So if there's a tougher zombie, or maybe multiple tougher zombies, this makes him way more effective for 1 combat. So that's a very good card. Here's an example of another ranged weapon that he could find. Also turns out to be a shotgun, but it's a 2 damage shotgun. That's still at range 1 and 1 hit, but is significantly more effective than his Remington 870. Yep, all the same except extra wounds. Here's an example, Blessed Bullets, that increases your range. Now, you don't have like weapon slots to like, have to put a limited number of upgrades on. Any of the cards that you have are basically just always active unless it says like the one-time use kind of a thing. Here's an example of a daytime one where you could move a foundering token, which just means that a portion of the city has sunken. So you can essentially use that to move the water to a different part of the city, move it out of your way. Ratings. This says once per night. So at the very least, they tend to make a lot of sense in terms of what they do. The night-day stuff is really more like hints so that you can organize them and only have to deal with the relevant set of items at any given time. Actually, there's one more thing I want to find, and it looks like it's not in his set. Okay, I found the example that I was looking for. So I mentioned before that we've got those cards that have the little moon in the corner. That means they can be used during the first hour of the night. That little cross, like a plus symbol, means that you can use it at the start of any hour during the night. So in her case, that's a 1 hour single-use item that just makes all of her shots this hour explosive. And again, there's a little cross symbol on each one of those night hours that indicates, to help remind you that you can use those any hour, whereas the moon one you can only use in the first hour. I think that's good for item cards, and also I think that's it for like the character stats. Okay, the common infected are not unique infected, and their stats are printed on the board. They are represented by cubes. So at the lowest rank, you've got vermin, who are these green cubes. Their stats are all ones. So the little claw means that they deal 1 damage, 1 stress when they attack. The little green droplet is their health, so they only have 1 health. And the foot is their movement. They only move 1 space in from the ring at a time. The white cubes are these Barricades. They are infected dog creatures. So 1 attack, 1 health, 2 move. They run at you. After all, 4 legs. The gray ones are your Goliaths. 1 attack, 2 health, 1 movement. They are, again, very, very similar to the fatties from Zombicide. They are the only one of the basic infected that has 2 health. These are the Molochs. The toughest of the basic Molochs, or the most dangerous, I suppose, because they deal 2 damage with each attack, and 1 health, 1 movement. So, the vermin, 1 in everything. Each of the other ones has an increase in 1 kind of stat. And this is essentially their weakest to strongest distribution. Notably, whenever the infected activate, either when infected are moving or when infected are attacking, they always go in the order of least to greatest in terms of infected. And it also says to activate them from the inside out. So ring 1, ring 2, ring 3. Now we have these very, very special boss monster infected, and they are represented by a tarot deck. And with each one of these, let's go back to our little camera. We've got their own set of stats. So this gross little fellow is the Warlord. 3 damage, 3 health, and, well, what does that mean? With his little footy mark. So now we look to the stat, and he's the one in the bottom. During the infected and boss movement step, place the Warlord in a random refuge space and make a strength 3 attack against a character in that space. He's kind of like a hunter from Left 4 Dead. He just jumps straight at you when he moves after spawning. But each one of these bosses is unique. You can only have 1 of them in play at a time. Here's another one that I think is my favorite looking one, is the Tenor. If he's in ring 1 after the infected and boss attack step, destroy all the barricades that are in his cave and the 2 caves adjacent to that, because he yells really loud and shatters the barricades. And something that's also really special is this game has amazing miniatures. This is another one that really makes me want to learn painting so that I can hope to do these things justice. Really hope this focuses well today. Look at that maw in his chest. And yeah, it's far more detailed than I can really show on these cameras. If you have a version of the game that comes with them, or I guess if you buy the miniatures separately, they are very, very nice miniatures. The bosses, big and nasty, all have neat special abilities, all unique. You can only have 1 at a time. So they always activate in the order they were drawn, whenever it's time for them. So you'd go through all of your common in the ring, and then you'd go starting at the top through all of the bosses that are in that same ring. I think that's good for our basic monster explainer. Okay, I think we're ready to explain the standard game setup. We'll go through the standard game first, and then we'll show an example of how to set up a scenario, because the tutorial we'll be playing is a scenario. So the very first step for campaign setup is just to shuffle all the decks of all the characters that you're playing with, the Boss Tarot deck, the Nightmare deck, and we'll explain what this thing does in a few minutes. You put your hour marker at dawn of the first day. Your day marker goes on to day 1. Your group marker goes onto the starting place that matches your difficulty level. So the very first level one would be the crossbones. Yeah, so up here. If you're playing easy, you would start your group marker over there. On medium, you'd start over there. And on hard, you'd start all the way out there. Okay, you put all of the infected, so all of these cubes go into the bag, which is hereafter referred to as the abyss. This is where all of your monsters, all your creatures, everything goes into that. So one cleanup step aside, it takes a while to sort all the cubes back out after everything is done. And I'll skip past this, but the only thing that says like one of them is more likely to come out than another one is just the total number of each one. So there are 45 of the vermin, 35 each of the white dogs and the purple Molochs. There are only 25 of the gray Goliaths, but that essentially means there are 140 cubes of zombies that go in there between those various colors. Now, there are 2 other things that get put into the bag as well, depending on the difficulty level. So over on page 15, if you're playing on easy mode, you start with 2 of the blue survivor cubes. These represent people that you would meet along the way in the city. They have some ability to help you out a little bit. When they come out of the bag, that typically is a good thing for you. In the worst case, they can be used as meat shields. So if we were playing on easy, it would be 2. I'm just going to put a medium amount in there. So in medium, you only put 1 in there. I got the 2 blue ones back out. So on medium, you only put 1 survivor in. And then there are these black paranoia cubes. These are bad things that can come out of the deck. Paranoia is basically another harmful status, kind of like being in terror. It reduces the actions that you can take. The black cubes are typically very bad when they come out of the deck. So on medium, you put 5 in, and on hard, you would put all 6 in. So relative to the 140 zombies that we've got in here, we only have 1 that's blue and 5 that are black. So not very good odds of getting the good one out of this enormous horde of cubes that's in that bag. Now, there's this nifty The Story So Far. The Story So Far is an abstraction around what were your characters doing prior to them all meeting up for this fighting retreat out of the city. It's representing them taking stress in order to find additional starting items where they can start the game with, or any other useful things they can find. So the way this works, it's a little bit of a press your luck mechanic, but the first thing that happens is, each character is going to do this 1 at a time, so just starting with 1, going down through 6. The first thing you do is you pick a cube at random blindly out of the abyss, and depending on its color, one of a number of different things can happen. And in this case, it's best to just read it right off the rules here. So if you get a green vermin, then this represents sort of attacked you while you were getting some supplies. So that character would take 1 stress, and you would also get 1 barricade to put into the character's collective supply. So the characters have a collective, I think it refers to them as storage, or say an inventory. The supply is actually like everything that's back in the game box, everything that's not in play. So the storage, the inventory, choose where you want to put your supply, and those are the things that your characters collectively possess. So in this case, we got a green cube, so that gives you 1 stress and 1 barricade. If you got one of the white cubes representing the attack infected dogs, If the character continues looking, so you have the option to like stop after the first one or keep looking for more supplies. If the character continues looking and you get stress in the next step, like we did for our green guy, then you get +1 stress for each of the white Barricades cubes that you've drawn. So the white one is, well, nothing happened right now. If you stop, you don't get any stress, but you didn't get any good things either. And it looks like the vast majority of things give you stress on this sheet. For the purple Moloch one, the character gets +2 stress, but you still get a barricade. If you get a Goliath, you would just get 1 stress, but you don't get a barricade if you draw one of the gray cubes. Now, the blue survivor cube, if you manage to draw your at most 2 survivor cubes during this setup step, then you get to put that survivor cube in storage. And if you draw a black paranoia cube, of which we put 5 in at the beginning, then it forces you to stop looking and you have to hide after this search step. Now, after you've done your very first drawing of a cube, in our case the green one, you have your choice to either go into hiding, where you just stop looking and you're ready to start the game, or you have the opportunity to press your luck and keep looking. So the first time you press your luck is the exact same thing. You draw another cube from this bag, and you would resolve it in the exact same way as you did the first round. When you press your luck for the third time, instead of drawing a cube from the Abyss bag, you draw one of the cards from the Tarot Boss Monster deck, and you suffer damage equal to the boss's attack value, but then you can either draw one of your character's item cards, which I think I would do 100% of the time, or you could choose to put another barricade into your inventory. I mean, barricades are great. They also sort of protect you from zombie attacks, but the character's item cards I think are so good, I would almost always choose that. So the first 2 times, draw a cube from the Abyss, resolve what it is based on that list of potential outcomes, and if you get to the third one, you draw Boss Tarot card. You take that much damage, or that much stress, straight up, and then you can either draw an item card or take a barricade. After one character has drawn any cubes that they're putting, all of the cubes that you didn't put in your barricade storage inventory, like if you drew the survivor cube and you got to keep it, everything but that survivor goes back into the bag for the next character to potentially draw. And after you've done this for each one of the 6 characters, you are ready to start the day with your day actions. Now that I've shown how the standard game setup works, I think we should go through the setup for a scenario, because we're going to be playing Plague in Venice. The game strongly recommends that if it's your first time playing, you start with this scenario. So one thing that, let's see if I can get onto the zoom camera, up on the top, it gives you all those symbols on the top are sort of helpful reminders of rules variations, although certainly I don't know what those things mean, at least just off the top of my head. But this scenario page is going to explain all of the things that we do differently. Okay, so let's see, there's setup over in this corner, it says setup over there, the turn sequence, if different from the standard rules, and any special phases that only occurred during this scenario that aren't part of the regular game are explained down here. Here is a replacement. There's only 2 day tickets instead of the 3 from the normal game, so it's only a 2-day game. And then you've got any special rules, you've got the description and what the victory conditions are for this scenario. Let's do the scenario description first. A new pestilence haunts the city of the lagoon. This time the dead have now come back to life. The corpse removers have a new task this time. Instead of bringing the dead from their houses to the common graves, they have to lock them in their houses, and not end up being eaten in the process, obviously. So in this scenario, we're playing as basically corpse sealers. We're trying to seal up houses so that the infected are stuck inside, essentially cleaning up the streets. Okay, so special rules. The game ends immediately with a loss if one of the following conditions occur. Okay, if the group has less than 6 barricades in storage at the end of the first night. The barricades normally are your protection during a holdout, but in this particular scenario, The barricades are something that you use as part of sealing the infected in the home, so if you have less than 6, you just don't have enough to complete the victory condition at the end. The second condition is if the group is not able to seal 6 locations at the end of each day. Well, there you go. We need to seal 6 locations each day during this particular, and it's only 2 different days here. Okay, so the scenario's setup. Place the group marker on the starting location with the big red skull. So it looks like it's telling us explicitly to start on that space. Then place 18 barricades in the storage. Let me grab those. Okay, I've placed our 18 barricades in the storage. There are a total of 6 more that are left in the supply besides that. Now we put 4 paranoia and 2 survivors in the abyss. Okay, so I'm going to need to add 1 survivor relative to what we did before, and I need to pull 1 black cube out of that bag. Again, be right back. Okay, done. And put the calendar marker on the day position of ticket 1 on this scenario sheet. So, yeah, and you'll be doing the tracking on the scenario sheet itself. I suppose it would make sense to play with it, like, directly on top. And it can all mostly be visible here. Good. Okay. So the turn sequence, yep, it calls the things that happen at sunrise and sunset the rituals. So we're actually going to go over this in terms of like the day phase and the night phase in a minute. But one thing that it does very helpfully do is the things that are unique to this scenario, it has them underlined. So after you do the event of the day, you do a special action called Prepare the Sigils, and it goes over that down here. Then, yep, the day steps, you do your movement, actions. Step 5, seal the buildings. Let's see, the only other one that's unique to this is at the end of the night, time moves forward, has some other extra special rules. So I think what would be best is for me to go over the normal turn sequence, and then once we're done with all of that, we can come back to looking at this scenario when we're getting ready to start playing, and we can look at what those couple of extra additional things for the scenario are. The very first thing you do at the start of every day is what it calls the sunrise rituals. That consists of 3 steps. The very first thing you do is you shuffle the nightmare deck. This deck is a bunch of cards that can provide you randomization. So to look at an example here, this one is a good example. So this top left portion is if you need to select a random character, you would draw a card, and this says it's character 5. If you need to determine a random location, then that's the flag in the top right. This is saying location 5 up on the map up at the top. So it looks like I see 1 through 12, and there's also an ABC in the corner. Other things are if you need to determine where a infected is entering the map, this thing says S2. So what that's saying is spawn the infected in the south, in space 2 of the south. So there's the number 1, 2, east 1, 2, west 1, 2. I feel like I could just roll a die, but there actually, I think, might be game balance implications in this, oddly enough, because each one of these has its own, positions. It's actually different from rolling a die because there's only so many south or north things. So I believe by using these cards instead of a die, it helps prevent that weird rolling case where all of your monsters have spawned in the north or something like that. That's a reason why, even though I would be tempted to just roll a die instead of using the cards, I believe it helps balance the game. In the bottom left corner, those are results that are used, I believe, for search actions, like what did you find? Did you find an infected? Did you find a survivor? There's another one, I think, for items. And this bunch in the middle is an event that could happen. The next thing you do, you need to determine a random location using the Nightmare deck. So in our example, the very first card that we pulled had this event 5. So the foundering tokens are these little, let me find them. I found it, had them up top. Foundering tokens are these little +1s, and you place them on top of the location that you just randomly determined. So in our case of 5, Now location 5 is foundering. That basically means that the zombies have managed to damage the supports under that section of the city, and it has started sinking. So that is now extra difficult terrain. It takes more time to move out of a location that's foundering, and you cannot spend the night in a sunken location. Basically, it's just too difficult to try to defend a location that's mostly sunken. The zombies can basically just come right up out of the water. If you try to spend the night in a sunken location or foundering location, it just immediately ends the game in defeat. If the location you draw already has one of the tokens, then you just go with the location that is next higher in the number sequence. And if you can't go any higher, then you would just go lower. And the last part of the sunrise rituals is to draw an event for the day. So looking back at our event card here, this one is called Ingenuity. Each character may discard an item card to draw a new item card from their deck. This is a very good event. But I'm pretty sure the other one is a negative event, Stormy Clouds, which makes your day shorter. So you have one fewer hours in the day, apparently. Now, after that, you move the hour over to this little, the first day hour marker, and then, after the sunrise rituals, you have to determine how many spaces around the city your group is going to move. Normally, it takes you 1 hour to move along each one of these lines in the city. You have to determine how many hours you're going to spend moving, so basically you plot out your move and then you execute it. Normally, it's 1 hour to move along each line, but you'll see that there's these +1s, or in one particular path, the one to get to the airship finale space, that's a +2. That is how many extra hours it takes to move along that line to that location. And what's worse, those foundering city tiles, they make it so that if you are in that location, it costs 1 extra hour to move out of that location. You move your token along the spaces that you've indicated, and you increase your hour tracker by the amount of time that you spent doing that move. Each hour that you spend moving is 1 less hour for all of your characters to take their actions later in the day. Now there's one restriction to the movement, like which directions you can move, which is on the second and third days. So you always have to perform your first movement of the day in the direction that you did your fighting retreat at the end of the previous night. There's no restriction on day 1, and there is no day 4. Once the group's movement is complete, then all of the characters can use each of the remaining hours in the day to perform day actions. And we'll go through the whole step of what those can be. But each hour, and specifically in the order, 1 through 6, each character gets to take 1 action in that hour. The first one is to rest. You can lower your stress by 2. Barricades. You can find barricades and put 3 of them in storage. That is 1 action once you're in the game. But again, because there's so few days, every one of these actions is very, very precious. The third action you can do, if your character has a daytime ability, that's an action that you can take, and we'll go through the characters at the end. The fourth action you can take is to search, and in that case, you would draw one of these nightmare cards, and that result that's in the bottom corner determines what happens. Okay, so going from left to right, if you get a person silhouetted in blue, you have found a survivor. And you can take a survivor from the supply and you put them into the abyss, meaning you can put more blue cubes into the bag to hopefully come out instead of zombies. If you find the middle result, that is an item. You can draw an item card from your item deck. The third one is you've been encountered an infected, so first you take 1 stress, but then you get your choice of the other 2 results. Okay, now the fifth action that you can take is if your location has a special action listed, you can take the location's special action. So an example is an arsenal. Location 2, where our group is currently sitting, is an arsenal. Special action, restock. When a character takes this special action, he can choose a character and then draw 1 card from that character's item deck and give it to him. The characters can also revive one of the other characters if they're incapacitated. When a character is reanimated, is what the game calls it, I just say revived, then you place their marker back on the board on the lowest space of the terror portion of the terror tracker, so the first red space. And after that point, they are able to take actions again. That does it for the character actions for during the day, so now it's time to talk about the sunset rituals. This is basically preparing the tactical map for your siege during the night. The tactical map itself, you can see that it's made up of different rings around the central area. This central area is where your characters will be standing and hopefully no zombies. It's called the Refuge. It has 4 different quadrants, just north, south, east, west. Each of the outer rings is also divided into quadrants, but each of those quadrants is further divided into 2 lanes. Now, the game likes to call each of the quadrants a pit for some reason. I think it's just easier to understand if I call them quadrants. It also calls each one of these different lanes a cave. You've got the Refuge, the first ring, the second ring, and everything outside of the second ring is just the third ring. So typically, your zombies are going to be spawning in the outer ring, and then they'll be moving inwards over the course of the night and trying to attack you. The first part of the setup is to discover the terrain. Now, one of the interesting things that I didn't touch on about these different locations is that there are very small little circles over each one of them. Let's get the tactical map hopefully very close, just so you can see one of them. There we go. So you can see there's little black ones, yellow ones, and potentially blue ones. And they don't all have like only 2 of them. There's a couple more examples. Try to limit that so we don't get too motion sick. Those different little colored circles around the outside of the location mark terrain features. The blue and black ones are obstacles that help the zombies and hinder your ability to defend the location, while the gold ones are fortifications that help you defend the location from the zombies. Okay, so for each one of the colored circles that's around the outside, you have to draw a tile of the corresponding type and then determine a random location for it to be present. Okay, for each one of the colored circles, it says to randomly draw one of those tiles from its pile. I would just spread them out and use a die, because it's not something you can blindly do unless you've got a spare bag lying around. And each one of them, like for the fortifications, there are exactly 4 of them, and each one of them has a completely different effect. For the obstacle tiles, whether they're blue or black doesn't really matter, because like one side is blue and one side is black for each one of them. So you just randomly pick one of these 8 different obstacle tiles, and then based on whether that particular circle was blue or black, you just flip it to the right tile. And something that it shows is, like, it's got a 1. So you would use the Nightmare card to determine which of the 8 lanes it goes in, and then this would go into ring 1. Whereas this blue one would go into ring 3 of whichever of the 8 lanes that you randomly picked from the Nightmare thing. I'll talk about what each of the different obstacles and fortifications do at the end of the night setup step, because each of them is sort of a exception to one of the standard rules for like in placing infected or performing attacks. After we've placed the different terrain features, then you place barricades. You can place your brown cubes that you have in storage. You can place them into those little boxes around the refuge. So there are the 8 different ones with 3 boxes each. If you have every possible barricade, then you could put 1 brown box into each one of these little barricade spots. When your character is going to be taking an attack from something that is outside the barricades, you can sacrifice a barricade basically to cancel the attack so the character doesn't take the damage. So the barricades are basically directional shielding from the infected. Obviously, you can only place as many barricades as you have. After the barricades are placed, your characters are placed in activation order into the area. So now we've got the player minis. They are noticeably a brighter white than the sort of darker gray of the infected. And in turn order, you place your minis into one of the 4 refuge spaces. Then it is time to place your boss monsters. So each of the boss monsters are going to have their mini placed on basically on top of the card. So when it comes time for night, you're going to take the nightmare cards and you're going to randomly draw one for each one of those bosses, and that's going to determine which lane that boss starts in the night. After you've placed any bosses who are left over from a previous night, already in the tarot card area, then it is time to spawn new monsters. On the very first night, there aren't going to be any in the tarot boss area. You place a number of bosses equal to the... So on the regular game, it varies based on the difficulty level. In the scenario we're looking at, the first night actually has no bosses, and the second night has 2, but in the regular game, you can easily get 3, 4, or 5 each night. If you're playing on difficult, it's 4, 5, 5. You've got a lot of bosses to kill. You're going to spawn that many bosses, you flip over the tarot, you get their miniature out, and then you spawn them into one of the lanes. You can have more than the 8 spaces you have here. You would basically just make another column and keep going, or just keep going down off the end of the board. That's not actually a restriction, the number of spaces over here, sadly. And that is it for the one-time sunset setup. And then we get into what happens each hour of the night. Each of the day or night is made up of 4 different hours. So in night in particular, you have 3 normal hours where you're going to spawn, move, fight. The 4th hour is very special, though. That one is basically called Dawn, and that's a fighting retreat, so that it has very different rules for the 4th hour. So each hour of this nightly combat, you get to do things in the following very specific order. The first thing is, if you have any items that say use at the start of the hour or on the first hour of the night, you can use items the very first thing during an hour. It is time to spawn infected. There are a lot of infected to spawn. Remember when there were 140 common infected in there? Yeah, you need that many. So for each of these 8 lanes around the outside, you draw 3 random cubes each hour. Oh. I felt like I had to be reading the rules wrong the first time I played this, but no, that's correct. So the example I just have, I've got a white, a green, and a purple, and you would just do that all the way around. The zombies are placed into the outermost ring, unless there's a special effect that overrides that. If you draw a black cube, then you have to place that paranoia status effect on a character who is in the same quadrant as the lane you just drew that cube for. If there happens to be nobody in that particular quadrant for some reason, you can choose any character to place the paranoia on instead. Now, if you draw a blue survivor out of the abyss bag, then you place them into whichever space that is. It may seem a little bit weird, but the survivors that are in the ring don't get attacked by the infected that are out there. The infected are just coming towards you. The purpose that these survivors play is that if there aren't any infected in that particular lane at the end of the night, then you rescue that survivor and they go into storage. If you don't do that, then they're just lost and they go back into the supply. So, in a sense, they're lost. After you've drawn those 3 cubes for each one of the 8 lanes, then it is time for the infected to move. Starting with the weakest infected and going from the inner rings out, the infected are going to move towards the center, the number of spaces that their movement says. Really, it's 1 for all of the infected except for the white one, and then the boss monsters all have their own either movement, or if they have a unique effect, it'll say it. The only thing that's weird about movement is if they are outside the refuge, when you have infected that are trying to move in from the first ring, they cannot enter a empty barricade box normally until all of the barricades have been destroyed for that ring. So you have to get rid of all of them before the infected can move into those. The cube guys, each one of them can take up the space of one of those barricade boxes. But the boss takes up all 3. So if you have a boss in the barricades, then none of the common infected are able to join them in those barricade spaces. So yeah, it's outer ring, middle, inner ring, and then they're in the barricades, which is essentially means that they're inside of the refuge with you. After the infected have moved, it is time for the characters to take their actions. Each character gets to perform 1 action. When I combine that with how many infected are spawning, it's only 1 action each hour and you've got 24 infected. Ugh. However, once per hour, each character can take 1 stress to take a second action that hour, unless they're affected by paranoia. This is where those black cubes come into play. If a particular character has been struck with paranoia, They are limited to one action per turn, and they cannot take the stress to a second action during that turn. Okay, now the different actions that a character can take. Movement. You can move from the quadrant that you're in to any of the other spaces. That's one action to reposition. The second action is called Assault. This is your melee attack, based on the melee stat of your character or any weapon that they may be possessing. They can attack one of the infected that is in the barricade boxes of their quadrant. So the guys in the barricade boxes, you have to fight with the melee weapons. You deal the damage based on the wounds that are on the weapons. If you've got like the 1/1, that's 2 attacks of 1 damage each. The third thing you can do is to fire with your ranged weapon. So using either their default firearm or if you have any other ones, you make a ranged attack at a infected that is in the quadrant that they are facing to the range that the weapon says. I did also talk about like the hits and the wounds. So based on the weapon, it will do a number of hits. You can divide those hits however you want between any space that is an eligible attack space. Each hit does a number of wounds, and if that weapon has explosive damage, it hits every infected in that space instead of just one of them. There are some restrictions in terms of who you can target whenever you're making one of those ranged attacks. So, number one, very simple, it must be within the range of your weapon. The second restriction is that you can only fire at the closest ring that has targets within that lane. You can't hit the guys in the second or third ring because they are essentially shielded by the guy in front of them. It's like they're going in single file or something. So you have to kill the first one before you can kill the second one, just ring by ring. Within a ring, you can hit whichever one in that first ring that you want. One special thing about bosses is the game says that they're the only ones that have retained some degree of awareness. They're, still slightly alive to some extent. And that makes them smarter. See, unlike Zombicide, you don't have to roll to hit. Your weapons just automatically hit because the zombies are dumb. But the bosses are the exception. They can hide behind the other zombies. So bosses hide behind common infected. You have to kill all of the common infected within a single space before you can hit a boss in that same space. Those infected that are in the barricades, you can't hit them with ranged weapons. You can only hit them with melee weapons. Further, having those infected in the barricade boxes, basically in the refuge with you, right in your face, they make it tougher to fire your ranged weapon at anything in the outer boxes. If you have zombies in the barricade, then you can take 1 stress, and that allows you to fire over. You can fire as though the zombies in the barricade boxes aren't there. Sort of a, well, I really need to hit that guy in a further outring, or like I only have a good ranged weapon and I don't have a good melee weapon, so I really want to be shooting and allow the other person to do the melee attacks. You can take a stress to shoot as though the zombies in the barricade are not there, to shoot at the infected in the outer rings. What else do we have? So we've talked about melee attacks and ranged attacks. We've got the survivors. So our friendly little blue cubes, if we've got any of them in storage, there's this survivor action where basically the survivor has a heroic burst of inspiration and they're sacrificing themselves for you. So you can take your blue cube, one of the ones that you have in storage, and you can place it. It's weird that it's your action to do this. You have inspired the survivor to make the sacrifice, I suppose. And you can place that survivor cube on any one of the boss monsters. And what that does is it negates the boss for 1 full hour of the night. That boss monster, it doesn't move, it doesn't attack, and its special powers are completely negated. Now let's talk about what happens when we actually kill the infected. The boss monsters, oddly, are a little bit more straightforward. When you kill them, or when you damage them, they take these red cubes as damage. When they've taken enough damage to meet their health, they are eliminated. You just put their tarot card on the bottom of the boss deck, their figure is removed back to the box, and then you can choose to either recover 2 stress and remove paranoia from any character of your choice, or you can draw an item card of a random character. So I'm assuming only the characters that are in the game, you would basically roll the die and you would get one of those cards. So it appears this is a way that you can get item cards of different characters. One particular note about bosses, because of their special status, they are immune to cards that affect infected. So, like in game terms, infected are really just the common infected, the cubes. If you've got a card that says, like, kill 2 infected, that can't be used against the bosses. Now, when you kill a common infected, something really interesting happens. Let me introduce you to the Pile of Corpses. It's this sort of tombstone-looking tile. The other side is actually the boat for the boat finale. But what this thing is, it has these little tool tokens. I think they're only used for this, but it says to place the pile of corpses on top of those 4 cubes. So whenever you kill a zombie and you remove its cube from the tactical map board, what you have to do is you have to drop it onto the pile of corpses, like so. If you've killed multiple zombies, you must drop them all together on the pile of corpses. Now, if that cube falls off of the pile of corpses as you're placing it on, then it goes right back onto the board. It goes into one of the 2 lanes facing the character that just eliminated it, and that character also gains 1 stress. If it's not bad enough that, yeah, you killed it, but all you really did was push it back, it was instantly replaced by another one of the same type, but you gain stress. And what's even worse, if the character who killed it was in terror and your cube fell off of the pile of corpses, every character gains stress. So this is a really, really weird mechanic. I've never seen anything like it in another game. I mean, you're going to be getting 24 zombies every hour for 3 hours. Now, there's no way you can kill all 72 of those zombies, plus all of the bosses and stuff. You can imagine this thing's going to be pretty full. And, it's not the most difficult, but even when it was, like, pretty empty, that was really not the easiest to get these things to not fall off on you. And especially if you did, you did a shotgun blast and you got 3 different zombies, you have to drop them all at the same time. You cannot let anything that's you're holding in your hand touch anything that's on the board, so you can't just set them down. No, there has to be a drop. It has to fall from your hand. It doesn't even have to be the zombie that you dropped. Like if you dropped one over here and it forced the other thing to fall off the edge, the one that fell off is the one that spawns. So any zombies that fell off during your drop, all of them get spawned. Now, at least the one thing that's not so terrible about this is that no matter how many zombies fall off of the pile of corpses and back into your tactical map, you still at least only get 1 stress. But yeah, this actually puts some manual dexterity into this game, and if you're not very good at that kind of thing, you're going to get infected coming back. So that's why this game feels crushingly difficult. It's the hordes of zombies that are coming at you, the very limited actions that you have to deal with them, and stress coming at you from absolutely every side. It certainly feels like overwhelming difficulty, but challenges are how you get heroes, so hopefully your heroes can overcome this crushing difficulty. At the very least, as opposed to Castle Panic, where you're going through the entire bag, you only have to survive the 3 hours. So something that starts in, like, the first ring on the first night, like it's going to move. The things that are spawning in the later rounds may not even reach you. So that's at least the saving grace of there's going to be so many zombies. But at the very least, the ones that spawn in the 3rd tier late, they're not really going to be attacking you during the normal course of the game. And that's what you do with the common infected. You put them on the pile, and if any infected fall off that pile, they go right back on. So now that I've scared you with the hordes of incoming zombies, let's find out how they attack. After all the characters have done their actions for the turn, then it's the infected attack phase. So interestingly, it's infected move, characters act, and then infected attack. All infected or bosses that are in the first ring, regardless of whether they're in a barricade box or not, they get to make an attack against a character that is in that same quadrant as them. Both of the two lanes that are in the north quadrant would get to make an attack against a character that is also in that north quadrant. There's no left half, right half kind of a thing. If there are no characters in that quadrant, then you have to choose any other character to take the attack instead. And your character takes stress equal to the damage on the infected's attack, the angry hand, the angry hand number. One thing that you can do to prevent that, if you have barricades in that lane, then you sacrifice a barricade to cancel the attack from that infected. If an infected has already made it past the barricades into one of those boxes, then a barricade can't protect you from that infected's attack. You can take one of the survivors that you have that is in your storage, and they can sacrifice themselves to cancel an attack as well. Infected attack is the last part of what happens in an hour. You move your hour marker forward to the next hour of the night, and if it's hours 1 through 3, you do the exact same thing again. Now, when you get to dawn, you have to fight your way out of this location so that you can continue exploring the city. Now, an interesting thing is, because you've got these different connections from like whichever location that you happen to be in, these actually restrict the directions that you can go. We're trying to get to position 8 for whatever reason, or okay, we want to go west from the location we're currently in, at least as our first move. The very first thing you do at dawn is you determine which way, north, south, east, or west, that you want to leave this location. And so you pick that direction, and you are doing a fighting retreat in the 4th hour. Each character gets to perform an assault action. So this is specifically using the melee weapons, not the ranged weapons. And you can attack any infected or boss in that quadrant, because in reality, you're running out of the location to leave on the group map in the next morning. Every character, in order, is going to make a melee action against any infected or boss in that quadrant. If you've got like one of those split attacks, where you can do that kind of split if you want. If you had a survivor that like sacrificed themselves, that survivor is removed. The boss is no longer stunned during this fighting retreat phase. Now, any infected that remain within that quadrant get to attack you. They attack one at a time, I'm pretty sure in the same order. Least to greatest, and then the bosses in their order top to bottom. Notably, if you have any barriers that survived, you cannot use barriers to cancel these attacks because you've basically packed them back up. You can still use survivors in storage to cancel attacks, but not barriers. And then you clean up. So the cleanup phase at sunset is any barriers that remained on the board go back into your storage. You do get to keep them. You're not abandoning them each time. You basically pack them up and then you run. You check to see if there were any survivors that you rescued. So if a survivor had no infected in its lane at the end of the night, you get to rescue them and you can put them into storage. It doesn't matter which quadrant they were in. They can, I guess, run to catch up. Any survivors that had any infected in their lane, they're just lost. They go back into the supply. After you've checked for rescued survivors, all of the infected from the tactical map and the pile of corpses go right back into that abyss. At the end of the night, all the paranoia cubes from the storage and the terror track go back in the abyss. So it does appear that the paranoia does go away at the end of the night. All the bosses go back to their tarot cards, all the characters and terrain gets removed from the board, your calendar marker goes to the start of the next day, and your hour marker goes from the dawn into the first hour of the next day. So that is how the night works. Now, there were 2 topics that I was saving for later after we discussed the combat stuff. The first one was the terrain features. So the first one we're going to look at are the catacombs. These are pretty much always in the innermost ring, and the catacombs, this allows infected to enter any vacant barricade box directly, instead of having to wait for all of the barricades to be destroyed. Okay, the other black type of obstacle, the buildings. So if there is a building in your way, then you can only choose to fire, meaning using your ranged attacks, against targets that are in the first ring. So the buildings are basically blocking your line of sight out to them. Now, when you look at the blue obstacles, you've got these manholes. Whenever you're in the infected spawn step, You draw and put one additional infected cube on this space, but this one has the advantage of starting closer in to your refuge. And finally, we've got the Pier. These always are in Ring 3, and in this lane, any infected or bosses that get placed, they start in Ring 2 instead of Ring 3. This ring is just shorter. Everything starts in Lane 2. Okay, so next up are the fortifications. Just like the negative ones, you draw a nightmare card to determine which quadrant it's going to go into. First one up is the altar. So any infected that's eliminated in this quadrant is instead just put straight back into the abyss bag instead of the pile of corpses. That is huge, because I hate that pile of corpses. Next up, we've got the bell tower. You can target with your ranged attack actions lanes that are adjacent to this pit. If you have someone who's sitting in the bell tower, go up to the main. So when it says lanes adjacent to this pit, like if it was on the east side here, then the pit would be this quadrant, and you can also target the lanes to either side, because then you don't have to divide your characters as much. Next up, we have the jerry cans. So this is fuel. In this pit, this quadrant, you may eliminate one barricade to treat any hit of a fire action as if they were all explosive. So one of your ranged attacks, like say the machine gun guy who gets 3 hits, each one of his attacks, each one of those hits, could be treated as though it was explosive. And finally, we've got the alley. In this quadrant, the only infected and bosses on the barricade boxes can attack the characters. Those who are outside, in just the ring section, can only destroy the barricades. Okay. When you're dealing with the alley, the infected that are outside the barricade boxes, cannot attack the characters. Instead, they can only damage the barricades themselves. In normal conditions, the zombies that are in this first ring are attacking the characters, and you can sacrifice the barricades to protect yourself. But in this case, the zombies are forced specifically to attack the barricades instead of your characters. Okay, the other thing that I promised to get back to later was going over what each of the different characters and their special abilities are. So he has Commander at night. At every night, he gets 3 special order tokens. There are 3 tokens that look exactly like that he gets to distribute. At the start of each night hour activation, he can put 1 order token in a refuge space, and its effect is immediately carried out. Each order token can only be used once per night. So he basically has 3 orders. He can use them on his activation. Each order can be used once per night. It does not take an extra action for him to do this. The first of his 3 orders is Fire at Will. Each character in the space that he has selected gets to take an extra ranged attack action. That's huge. So if you've piled several people, like into that bell tower, for example, they each get to take an extra fire action. Second order is No Fear, No Remorse. Each character in the space he's selected recovers 1 stress and removes paranoia if they have one of those black cubes. The third action is Fight or Move. Each character in the space takes an assault, which is the melee attack, or a movement action. His day ability, Veteran, eliminate a boss in the boss area. Put the boss tarot back into the deck. You do not get any bonus for eliminating a boss using this ability. He is Captain Badass. His action during one of those hours. Let's just get rid of that boss. It's no longer following us. He tracks it down and eliminates it. The next one on the list here is Brighella, Heavy Weapons Specialist. Knight ability as Heavy Weapons Specialist. On his turn, pick back from one of the barricade boxes to Ring 1 and infect it in your pit. The Knight abilities, as a reminder, do not cost an action to do. He can just do this. Whichever quadrant he's in, he can just knock all of the zombies from the barricade boxes, where you can only use the assault abilities on them, back out into the Ring 1 spaces. I assume that's with his heavy weapon. He just bashes them out. And his day ability, which does cost a daytime action, is to help. Take +1 stress to use the day ability of another character in play. Next up, we've got Colombina. Her night ability is Sniper. She can hit any infected or boss in her quadrant. She can ignore obstacles such as that building that blocks your line of sight, and she can also ignore the obligation to attack the closest target. Her day ability is Exploration. Remove one obstacle of a chosen color from the group's location. Whatever space you're in, like 5 here, we've got 2 blue and 2 black. She can say, let's remove 1 blue obstacle. Like you will draw 1 less of the blue obstacles when you are placing your terrain features for that night in the location. Next up, we've got Medico della Peste. He's the doctor. And, sorry, switch back over to him. His night ability is Medic. At the end of his activation, remove paranoia and recover 1 stress from a character in his quadrant. And that can also just be himself. So, hey, every hour he gives somebody a little bit of soothing, recover a stress. He also has a second night ability called Mentor. Inflicts +1 wound in both assault and fire for each survivor in the storage, and any survivor actions require the medic's permission. Meaning, if another character wants to sacrifice a survivor, you have to get this player's permission to do so, because he is the caretaker of all the survivors you've rescued. His daytime ability is Treatment. He can remove 3 stress from a character of his choice, which may include himself. So, yeah, there's your medic. Now we've got Pantalone. His night ability is an Engineer. He can put 1 barricade in one of the barricade boxes in your pit. You can do this only if there are no infected on the barricade boxes of that pit. Now it does say put 1, so I believe that means you can't just do this over and over again. Let me just check. Yep, this just says a character's night ability is always performed or active during the activation. It does not count as an action, does not require spending actions to be performed. So I think that means that you could have Pantalone, the Engineer, completely fill up all of the barricade boxes in his pit, as long as there are no infected in that barricade boxes, so he can repair the barricades. His daytime ability is Enhanced Barricades. Normally, one of your characters can spend an action to put 3 barricades in storage. Pantalone can put 4 instead. And the last of the normal 6 is Arlecchino. His night ability is Commando. Once per hour, he can make an extra movement action. So this guy is basically the guy who can move around and provide extra firepower to help out the other folks. His day ability is Gift. Name 1 character and do a search action with the following results. If you get the item result, draw an item card for that character and give it to them. If it's a survivor, you put 1 survivor into the Abyss bag. And if it's an infected, choose between the 2 previous options. You get no stress from the outcome. So he's a really good searcher as well. Besides the 6 that we've just looked at from the character reference, we also have 3 other ones. So let's go over Balenzone next. Show what his character guy looks like. Balenzone. Wow, he has 4 attacks? Okay, we've got to look at his whole... We'll start with his day ability. He is a hunter. He cannot perform the Barricade or Reanimate. When he performs a search action and gets the infected result, he just recovers a stress instead of choosing an item or survivor result. His night ability is Loner. He cannot gain the paranoia status and ignores the effects of terror. He has the attribute Infiltrator. During his entrance of sunset rituals, meaning when you place him, instead of placing him in the refuge, you place him in a Ring 1 space. He cannot enter the refuge. He only has 1 possible action he can take called Stalk. This guy is weird. Divide his assault value into movement and assault. Okay, that's why he's got 4 1-1-1-1-1s things. For each movement, he can move to an orthogonally or diagonally adjacent space, but he cannot enter the refuge. So he's literally moving around the battlefield. For each assault, deal a wound to a boss or infected in the same space. Assault is performed before or after all movement during the action. Interesting, so he's basically got 4. He could do 4 assaults. He can do 1 assault and 3 move, but he cannot do assault, move, assault. Then over on this side, he's got Caught in the Open. If Balenzone ends an action in a space containing infected boss or the Leviathan, I imagine that's in one of the finales. If there's at least 1 infected in the space, he gets a stress. He gets a stress for each boss in that space, and he gets 1 stress if the Leviathan is in that space. That's definitely why this guy is considered an advanced character. I wouldn't recommend him for game 1. And other general rules. He cannot cancel an attack by sacrificing a survivor from storage. He cannot perform the survivor action, which is when you place a survivor on top of a boss to stun them. And if there are no more valid targets for an infected or boss attack, meaning there's nobody left inside the refuge, then the game is over. Yep, normally you lose if everyone's incapacitated, so he doesn't count towards incapacitation. Next up, we have Rosaura, the Inventor. So she has a melee attack of 1. She has a crossbow as her ranged weapon, which is not too exciting on its own. 1 hit for 1 wound at distance 1. But her abilities, let's take a look at those. Her day ability is a designer. She cannot perform the search action. Instead, she can perform the design action. Design. Draw 3 item cards from the deck of a character of your choice. Keep 1 card, and put back the remaining 2 on top of the deck in any order you choose. So you're both searching the other decks to know what's coming up, and also you gain 1, and it's from any of the other characters who is in play. That's right, because she does not have an item deck of her own. Her knight ability is Capricious. She can perform the Caprice action. That action is give an item card you control to its owner. That character immediately performs 1 extra action. You need that character's permission to do this. So if she has taken Captain Spaventa's tobacco, then as her knight ability, she can be capricious, give that character the item that she found, and then he gets to take 1 extra action without taking stress for it. In addition, when activated, she can draw an item from any discard pile. Ooh. So that's in addition. So she gives an item card to somebody else, and she can draw an item from any discard pile, turn it 90 degrees clockwise, and then if it gets discarded, remove it from play instead. So she basically gets like a second use of any item that gets expended. Neat. Her general attributes, she is an inventor, so during setup, she draws 1 item card from each of 3 different characters. And, she can choose characters not in play for this one. Each time Rosaura would draw an item, she can draw it from the item deck of any character in play. And Rosaura can use any item description except those with an underlined item ID. A normal card that does not have an underlined. But if I go down here to Weapons Locker, that has an underlined weapon ID. I didn't even notice that before. So maybe that means she can't use it, but she could still pick it up, and then she could give it to the character who owns that card, and then they could use it. But she can't make use of that weapon's description, which I interpret as all of the text on the card, which means if she tried to use it herself, it would just do nothing. So that's weird. And now we've got the character who is so weird, he has a character reference sheet all to himself. Meneghino. So he has some real weird stuff there. His gun is an organic gun that does 1 hit, 1 wound at 1 range. Everything else, we're going to have to take a look and try to figure out what this means. His day ability is Dominator. So he can draw a cube from the abyss. If it is an infected cube, enchain it. It's the attribute collector. If you draw a paranoia or a survivor cube, put it back and draw again. So he's like an infected tamer. Weird. So, okay, his attribute collector, let's just skip straight to that. He is able to enchain an infected in the following conditions. When he is making a assault melee attack, and the chain box assault 2 is not active, when we're looking at his image, he can chain an infected when he makes a melee attack. He can do that when he's doing the search action and gets the infected result. He draws it from the abyss and proceeds to the Dominator ability. I guess based on the color of it, it improves his attack. Interesting. So if you've got a vermin, it gives him an extra hit. If you've enchained one of the purple guys, it makes his attack better. If you enchain a Goliath, then he gets explosive added to his attack. Okay, so when he's making an attack action, he basically just dominates the beast instead, and then that gives him an attack with damage too. When an infected is in a chain box, that chain box is activated. When he is resolving his background, the story so far, he can choose to get 1 stress to an enchain and an infected instead of applying the effects. So when he's drawing cubes at the start of the game to determine like what items or barricades he's found, he can do an enchain there instead of applying the normal effects. So he can start out with at least some of his boosts active here. His Knight ability, Provocateur. During his activation, he can move an infected from the ring 1 of the pit, where he is located, to a free barricade box of the same pit. Interesting, so he can do a get over here and move an infected into a barricade box that's open. If he doesn't have his melee attack activated yet, then he can enchain somebody who's in that pit. Infected enchain boxes can only be removed by sacrificing them. He can sacrifice an enchained infected at any moment to remove 1 stress from himself. When an infected is sacrificed, put it back into the abyss. Okay, so he could still just keep doing his get over here, grab a guy, enchain him into the melee slot, and then sacrifice it to remove a stress from himself. The Knight abilities don't take actions, so as long as there's somebody in the ring 1 in whichever quadrant he's in, he can just suck them into an empty barricade box. It does take his assault action to put them onto his card, but then he could immediately sacrifice him to get a stress back. Okay, so there is at least a limit as it takes his assault action to get that stress. Remember that infected doesn't affect boss monsters, so he can't do his chain thing to kill bosses. It is not possible to enchain infected that cannot be placed in a chain box. If he does enchain an infected that can be placed to a chain box, eliminate the infected as if it were eliminated in an assault. And then what's on the back of his... Oh, these are additional... So like whichever expansion or whatever that he came with has also these additional boss monsters that came with it. Definitely I'd recommend starting with the basic 6 that it shows on this side of the sheet, because they are way easier to understand. So those are all of the character abilities. And of course, like many games, there are some character reference cards that just have everything in this enormous dump of information, but it explains the concepts. You know, at least like, oh, what does this thing mean? You can refer to this card and have a pretty good idea. So now we've got our last topics for the rules discussion is finales. At the end of the 3rd day, you enter a finale one way or another. If you haven't managed to trigger any of the, like the boat finale or the bridge or the airship or the holy bomb finale, you have to play the A Night Without Dawn particular finale. So it's basically 3 days and 2 nights, like a really terrible cruise. And that 3rd night, it's got this little special reminder with all the finales around it. And that's also why they've put the Leviathan picture down here, is to remind you there is no 4th day. Venice is gone after 3 days, one way or another. Try to get out if you can. You just follow the instructions, just like when we went over like the scenario guide. Each of the finales actually can be played as a standalone scenario, so just follow the same rules for setup, special rules, etc. And one last thing that is kind of neat that this game does is the game designers added a scoring system. I guess if you want to compare your levels of success with other players, it actually has a scoring system on the back of the rule book. Yep, back of the rule book. So the scoring, you get 5 points for each character who is not incapacitated at the end. If all 6 characters are incapacitated, you just lose, so no points are awarded. But each character who makes it all the way to the end, 5 points. You get plus 3 points for each survivor you've rescued, which there are survivors that are in your storage at the end of the game. I imagine that the finales, if you haven't sacrificed the survivor, they escape with you. So 3 points for each of those. You get 20 points for playing on hard mode, where you give yourself very little time you have to move a lot farther to escape the city, and you have more bosses to fight. And it gives you plus 2 points for each player who you're playing the game with. So, because as it says, it's easier to play solo. So as one player, I would get 2 points. But if you were playing with all 6 points, you would have, or 6 players, you would have 12 points. So, all of you out there, you can, if you get a copy and play with a bunch of friends, you can get more points than I possibly can. And it also has some subtractors. So For each stress point that you have at the end of the game, it's -1 point. And if you're playing on easy mode, you get -10 points. So yeah, if you'd like, you can play and compare your difficulty with others or try to beat your record. I think that is it for all of the rules and everything that I needed to cover. So great, I think we're ready to play.